Hi, everyone. Good evening. We are really lucky to be ending the day with a poetry reading. So I'm going to do less talking so that they can do more reading. But it's really a pleasure. I'm delighted to share the stage with three poets whose work variously challenges us to think in creative and nuanced ways about the body, about language, about politics, about the everyday, and, as per the title of our session, the nature of imagination. So we've gone a lot of places today: black holes, the Congo, talked about history, imagination in a lot of different ways. But I think poets are really fantastic artists with whom to think about imagination as something that's not just free, wild, unbridled, creative, but also something that perhaps, and you can dispute this, but something that blossoms under constraint, perhaps, as in the generative constraints of poetic form. Aris, in your inauguration speech, when you became Poet Laureate of Houston, which is awesome, Aris described her sister having taught her to, quote, "string my imagination to the end of a rope and wait for the wind to catch it," end quote. And I just really love that image, and I thought it's something we can start with, because you're figuring imagination, if I understand you right, as both powerfully tethered and free, something catalyzed both by the poet's purposeful act of stringing and also the wind's no less meaningful act of catching. So I wondered, as just maybe an opening question so we can hear all of their voices, maybe I'll start with you, Rohan, and then move back. What is imagination for you?
It's a very interesting question, and also the oldest question in the book when it comes to poetry. I guess imagination is freedom in that sense for me, particularly when I'm thinking about writing under duress. I'm going to start a poem which sort of addresses that. But to be short, I think imagination is freedom in that way. In the absence of civil freedom, in the absence of, Aruni just talked about so much of that. I think for me, formal innovation, imagination, and that kind of political subversion in form and language means freedom, and all of that has to do with imagination.
Aruni?
Thank you for the question. It could mean a lot of things, but for me, imagination is the ability to see something that people who are not artists can't see. And in Assamese and Bengali, I think the word is drasta, which means somebody who can see something beyond the naked eye to the mind's eye. And there are many legends about it. I don't have the time to tell you, but it is something that not everybody can see, that not everybody can imagine, not everybody can actually speculate. So to be able to see something that everybody cannot see. And I think that is beauty.
I love it. And Aris, I did an unfair thing to you since I quoted you to start, but would you revise or add anything? Or, like I said, feel free to dispute also what I did with your image.
No, for sure. Thank you for bringing that into this space, and thank y'all for y'all's lovely articulations of this concept. I think for me, imagination is something that is fostered and fueled. I think from the youngest age, kids have imagination. People are growing and thinking and imagining and building and creating, and then somewhere along the line, constraint can limit imagination. And I think that it's a really brilliant tool that can really push past constraint and live alongside constraint into this really fruitful freedom into imagining a world, creating a world against all the things that will push imagination down. So I think it's something that we're born with, built with, and that needs to be fostered lest it be stifled.
I love that. Thank you. And shortly, I did promise not much talking. You're going to get to hear works of imagination from each of these poets. And just listening to all three of you already, I'll maybe reissue this invitation later. But as you listen to these artists, also maybe even close your eyes and we can try to inhabit together that space that the three of them were just sketching for us. So I'm going to invite each of them to read in turn, but I want to maybe have a little conversation as well before they read. And so I want to start with Rohan Chhetri, who is the author of numerous books of poetry, including Slow Startle, Jurassic Desire, and Lost Hurt or In Transit Beautiful, as well as the co-editor with Kazim Ali of a volume on the understudied poet, Sri Laureate. And Rohan, I'd like to ask you, if I may, about the relationship between poetry for you and storytelling, and how your work plays with narrative at different scales. So for me, in reading some of Rohan's work recently, I've been thinking that some of it operates at the level of the episodic, some of it operates at the level of maybe the epiphanic, also perhaps even the epic. I'm thinking, for example, of a poem like Elegy Written on a Clock Face with No Hands. That's the title. And Rohan is also a master titler. I just want to throw that out there. This poem begins with a kind of painful scene of a taxi hitting a stray dog. But then it progresses toward and ultimately reveals itself as this very powerful parable about death and the self. And I think many of your poems, again, feel free to correct me if this is not maybe a reading that is compelling, but they seem to move very much between the everyday and the otherworldly. So we have angels and howling winds, and we also have a grandfather who's squirreling away money in the poem Towards Some Dark. So there's another poem, for example, titled His Charred Hand Holds the Blueprint Among the Ashes, in which you tell the story of the narrator's grandfather's death. But it's also a poem about life after death and how the dream world seeps into the everyday. If I can quote one more poem of Rohan's, I think it's not the exception. There's a man who survives a train accident, and he's specifically able to, quote, tell his story of survival on television because he is already far away from the real thing. And so that's my question for you, Rohan. What is the enabling condition of your storytelling? And what does poetry allow you to do that another genre might not?
Thank you so much, Ragini, for those very interesting close readings of these poems. And these are poems that Ragini just quoted. They're from my first book. So it's been a while since that, and it was really interesting for me to hear that. I think my relationship with narrative is not, is kind of a vexed one. As you can see, even in the first book, where I really did employ the power of narrative to kind of swirl and move away and stray. It was very discursive. I always wanted that. It was never narrative in the sense of a beginning and an end, transformation from one point to another. And over the years, by the time I'm in this book, Lost Hurt or In Transit Beautiful, I have, I think, deepened that relationship to narrative, where I have worked with forms. I'm very interested in the churning rather than the kind of sort of teleological, sort of from one point to reaching at some place. It's recursive. It is just in the sense of how life and memory is, which are things that I'm writing about, and which I realize that when you're writing about memory, you need to understand how memory itself works. So in so much of my poems, I'm trying to do that interplay on the level of language and form itself. So yeah, I could actually read a poem and then maybe we could sort of get into that. Is that what we're doing, or,
Well, I think
or should we just do the
you're
questions
welcome
first?
to. No, you're welcome to. Whenever you're ready to read. There's always going to be more that we want to say,
Oh,
but
yeah.
I have probably like teased the audience too much already. So if you'd like to share, and just to note, right? So Rohan was just commenting, of course, that he's going to read to us, I think, from your newest book, right?
I'll read from the new
Yeah.
book, Lost Heard or in Transit Beautiful, and this sort of is already moving into a different territory, and I'll just read, actually. I think that's the best way to get into it.
Do you want to read at the podium?
No.
You're okay?
This is fine.
Okay.
Okay, and this is called King's Feedery, and so much of the themes from my first book kind of seep into this one. King's Feedery. After the rape and the bloodbath, the savage king and his men retired to a long shed built in an open field by a thin river fashioned for this lull in the pillaging so the horses could rest. One by one, they scrubbed blood off their fingers and faces and sat down to devour a feast of rice and goat served by the villagers. The legend remains only in the name of a lodge built in the same place, which from the Bengali means the King's Feedery, where the king took his meal. We say death stays here when it visits someone in the family. The time it came for grandfather, it arrived late, not at the wolf's hour between midnight and first light, but late morning on the highway, siren blaring all the way to the nursing home. As if punishing us for what it botched, it hung around for a few months at the feedery, then came for my aunt. Young, suffering in a marriage, she was taken straight by her weak heart. I imagine them, father and daughter, sitting still across a table, sharing a meal of steaming boiled potatoes, and always in the afterlife, that vague dream of salt. Death takes in threes, they said. We feared it would come for one of us. In the trashed room, they found Death's ledger full of illegible scrawls in a dark meter no one could understand. Grandmother's devastation circled complete. That year, a channel of clear water began thrumming beneath her skin. We heard it rumble whenever she opened her mouth to speak. When I think of love, I think of her weeping as I left, her swollen lip grazing the back of my hand through the car window. Brief and bright, her long blurred life now summoned with death lurking at the borders again. Married at 13, adolescence lost weeping into a cauldron of chopped onions. She talks of the flimsy wooden hovel perched on 4 frayed stumps, and in her telling, it is always how she saw it first. Herself decked in gold with that sinking dread, a preface. I think of love, and I think how, when they lifted grandfather's bier, she called out to him crying, "My child, my God, my child."
One of the things that I was thinking, and I don't know the answer to this question, but if any of you have taught this poem of Rohan's, if I was ever to teach it, I think maybe one question I would ask my students is how many stories are in that poem? And I didn't count, but I think there's sort of an answer maybe to that opening provocation I asked you about what the poetic form allows you to do as a storyteller that perhaps some other genre certainly couldn't do in quite that way.
Yeah, there is that sense of association, there is a sense of swirl that every story holds another story, and that kind of, and you allow that in the poem, and poetry is one of those forms where you can do it with impunity in that way. I would love to hear what Aruni would have to say to that.
It's legal, you can answer.
Thank you. I actually think my poems are stories. As I said, they are actually footnotes to my first novel. When I was researching my first novel about the insurgency in Assam, and a lot of stories I heard, noted down, I couldn't include them in my novel because obviously the novel has a very strict narrative sequence. So these poems kept on appearing in my mind, and these stories actually took the form of verse in some ways. So I have obviously dramatized them a lot. They're not necessarily like documentary clearly documents what I heard. And I think it really freed me up in some ways because it freed me up from the binaries of legally provable binaries of true and false, and I was looking for literary truth and emotional truth, and I could go beyond and think about the form of the narrative. So I think my poems are actually short stories in verses. So do you want me to read now?
I'm not gonna let you read.
Okay.
But we will come back to Aruni because I think that's a beautiful answer, and I want to share a little bit more about your work before you read. But Aris, I don't know if you want to talk about story at all, if that is something of interest to you. We can come back to that in a second. Sorry, with three of them, I want to ask each of them a million questions, and I'm being very constrained. But Rohan, is there another poem you'd like to share with us of yours?
Yeah, sure. Sure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read something that is outside of the book that might appear in my next book. This poem is called, it's a sestina, and I'll tell you why it's a sestina, but it was written over a span of 2 days, in a harrowed span of 2 days, in September of 2021. But I really began thinking through the images in this poem during the kind of ravages of the Delta variant in India and the kind of news feed that we were getting, particularly thinking about language made to perform under duress. And you said something very interesting, Ragini, about the kind of constraint, the blossoming of that comes out of constraint. So I kind of wanted to think through that language made to perform under duress, and sestina, and for that I had to reach out to this 12th century French poetic form invented by troubadours. And why is because it's an obsessive, it's a brutal, demonic form, I think, because it has 6 stanzas of 6 lines each and a triplet in the end beautifully called Envoy. But these 6 stanzas end with 6 words that are repeated throughout. So all of the 6 stanzas end with the same 6 words in different variations. So you're kind of trapped with those 6 words that you choose in the beginning. So it has this kind of obsessive, brutal kind of rhythm. And at that point in time, with the cycle of images that I was seeing from the Delta variant in India, that it just felt that I had to reach for a form that approximates that devastation. I'm going to read this poem now. Acedia sestina. How now to rig the petrified words to reveal the infinite in a new permutation of language? How to green again the fallow bandwidth of talk when fire is funeral and river means hearse, when a syndrome grows precise in the panic blue air, where weaving death's black wing, a muted swarm descends, an empty swing, uproot the new park benches to reveal cindered bones, the phantom smell of burnt hair watering the mouths of the wretched. Gauge his strength as the naked king pulls the black hearse of myth through the jaundiced streets, bragging its width. In the shallow arms of the prison cell, a width of man's breath can keep his body warm. A flap of wing means sky to be executed without a hood. As the hearse pulled fair of the nation's dead reveal, froth drying in the mouth of his language, the king's men upholster the king's velvet chair. pitch to the injured choir. His rabbit hose feed the bandwidth of fear that plugs the old fault line, prunes language to the dull blade of history's axe swing. What the news stifles, the river unveils. The shallow graves of sand, the watery hearse. On the shore, the stray dogs of my nation rehearse a new hunger. Heat drags in the air what a flanked disturbance of crow's flight reveals. A bloated corpse, twice its living width, strangled in a bush. A ballooned arm like a black wing, fastened to what has no face in language. The dogs were feeding off this language, this purple delirium washed up in a hearse. Then the keening vultures begin to descend, their wings unpedaling like something extracted them mid-air. I had to remember this, wake and find the width of my body bound to this boat for this tidal reveal. At high noon, when the width of each shadow's wing dwarfs, I did not rehearse this. I had no guide to veil the language for what was killing us out of thin air.
Thank you so much, Rohan. I'm going to skip over you, Aruni, but I'm not leaving you behind. And I want to reintroduce Aris Kian, Houston's own poet laureate, a graduate of the University of Houston, a champion slam poet, a teacher, an activist, and more. As poet laureate, if I understand correctly, Aris has undertaken a multi-phase collaborative project that involves interviews, oral histories, found poetry, and translation. And what that means is, I think, like Rohan, like Aruni, Aris is very much involved in rethinking what the work of poetry is, what constitutes a poem, in really beautiful and powerful ways. So Ari mentioned already at the top of this session, Aris's really fantastic inaugural speech when she became our poet laureate earlier this year, which I all recommend you read. And I was struck by the way in that speech you really emphasized the power of language, storytelling, voice, and the tongue. And the tongue, of course, we know has this kind of metaphoric resonance as language, but it's also a muscle, right? It's a muscle, it's flesh. And as I was reading some of your other poems, I noticed that I think you play a lot with this image or figure of the tongue as muscle, of this sort of physical, sensual, embodied mouth with all of its component and associated parts. So, for example, in the poem I'm Told, you start with the image of a swallowed tongue. You write, quote, "An open mouth is always full." The poem Under Construction offers us a stiffened smile, a pulsing jaw, parted lips, a perfect mouth that is always wanting. Aris has written a very poignant response to the horrors at Uvalde, titled "In Texas, We Pop Prayers Like Pills." And that also begins with the line, quote, "Hide them beneath our tongues and swear like hell we'll swallow. God sends floodwaters to wash the backlog still lodged in our throats. When did you last choke on a new name?" And then later in the poem, we have an abbot. I think everybody here knows who that abbot is, and he's licking blood from his palms. So Aris, my question to you is if you could share a little bit about how the voice, the mouth, the tongue have figured in your work to date. I mean, is this a motif that you still return to? Is it something that maybe characterized your earlier work, and how and why?
Yes, this is something my peers would call an obsession in the workshop. That started showing up very organically. I did not think about it, and it was pointed out to me. And I think one of the reasons why it shows up so much, one is because I got my origins in poetry as a slam poet, and one of the things that we think about is articulation and the power of the tongue, literally. Being able to, I would have exercises in which I would put a pencil in my mouth and have to recite my poems over and over. There's something really valuable and necessary about the exercise of articulating language, and about the exercise of articulating your own story. I also think about the city as its own sort of hungry device, this hungry monster that has a mouth, because the city, I believe, tells the story of its people, whether or not it's told by the people or not. There's something exercised in that, in what we can see of the city and what our streets look like and what's on our walls and what's not told. So I think about the mouth, I think about the body, I think about language, I think about our ability and our willingness and our excitement to speak, especially whenever we are in such a beautiful oral tradition. So yeah, that shows up a lot in my work. It showed up a lot in my earlier work. It will still sneak its way into my current work. But yeah, it really did define how urgent I thought of the poetic imagination, how urgent I thought of language and our willingness to share our own stories.
Thank you so much. Will you share some of your work with us?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with a poem that thinks about the mouth-ish. It's called Land Acknowledgement 3, and it was written in a series of poems that responded to the land acknowledgement of being in a space where you acknowledge the folks, the indigenous folks that were here before us. I thought about that. I wrote a land acknowledgement, and then I wrote a response to the land acknowledgement, and then I wrote another response to the land acknowledgement. So this will be the third articulation, Land Acknowledgement 3. Land Acknowledgement 3. Let me begin again. All that good gold knows not what we have stoned it into, but we do. What we've slated between the brick, bright with monopoly dollar bills and a barrel down the throat, I know what this is. Why we beef more than we bison. Pile drive our history into headstones, head first and choked at the neck, make no mistake. I don't wonder how Sugarland gained its name. I know about Arcola, that breathing monument of a brutal beginning, how Siena is 17 minutes from Darrington Unit. Did you know the whole city of Rosharon runs its wires the miles between the prison and the plantation? We brush our teeth in magnesium, dust the sucrose from under our shoes. This shuck and jive circle suck still can't pronounce Karankawa, still can't say slave without tasting the sweet. See what we've made of this land. Fields of sugar cane still swaying in the southern wind. We utter their names with no assortment of rock roses, no coneflowers, no consequence. Just the rot of our teeth with the lick of our tongues, a calcified reparation hanging from the jaw. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. I can read another poem or we can chat.
Nope.
Okay.
Please.
A lot of the poems that I've written, one, thank y'all for listening. I'm so glad that y'all are here, and I'm so glad to be alongside y'all. A lot of the poems that I've written in this this short collection were written in 2020 to 2021 to 2022. That moment was defined for a lot of folks for the early days of the pandemic, but for me it defined my relationship with the city as an organizer and my oppositional relationship to the state. there were 600 people there were 60,000 people who were protesting, and when people look at Houston, in their response in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, they really value and praise the ways in which we showed up. But a lot of the things that they don't talk about were the 600 people that were arrested that night after the protest. And so I spent a lot of my time in front of the jail, offering jail support and ensuring that those folks had an ability to get home and were able to find their way out of that very traumatic situation. So I wrote this poem thinking about that space and also just our relationship with our own city, how it changes alongside us, changes from the ancestors and the elders that hold this space, and watch it change with and without their say-so. My grandmother say inside or outside. My grandmother say inside or outside, but stop letting my cool air out the house. She say you smell like outside. Say be inside before the street lights cut on, I come home. Try to walk through the threshold, land at the gas station just up the block and blink. Funny? That's never happened before. Open the door, step foot in a Starbucks parking lot. I try to find the hallway to my bedroom, and a soul cycle class starts where my bathroom used to be. I step back and trip on the B-cycle rack, wonder why I never noticed it there, yell my grandmother's name and hear, please step back from the platform edge. I don't know when the city started seeping into the living room, but I do know that no one knocks anymore. Mayor Turner opened our pantry and started snacking on my Cheetos. Chief Finner cuffed on my wrist to the stairwell, which looks a lot like North San Jacinto Street somehow. Outside became inside before I could wash the smell off me, though some will call that progress. The way I scrub my skin to gravel till no one can tell me from the mural right outside the grocery store. Seems like they lift the concrete straight under my feet the second I cross some old street painted some new name. So now, my grandmother claims the whole neighborhood, calls the sidewalk her sunroom. Every cross street her countertop says what's yours is mine. What's mine is still mine, remembers the old brick. The cement on the feeder got that scent of fresh linen and firewood still held in the old house. Nothing's ever really gone. Not when you count the ghosts grown familiar with a full mouth of packed down asphalt and rubber tires. Can't find no outside untouched by a memory or a mother's mother or a mile of construction swirling with dust. How the outside climbs its way through the cracks, through the screen, through the breeze from the window that blows just so.
Thank you so much. I hope we might have a couple minutes at the end to circle back to everyone, but I'm going to now return to Aruni Kashyap, who many of you heard in conversation in the last session. And I want to just maybe reintroduce briefly by saying that Aruni is a novelist, a short story writer, a translator, essayist, poet who writes in both English and Assamese. He's also director of the creative writing program at the University of Georgia. And as you'll hear shortly, Aruni's poetry collection that's been mentioned before, There Is No Good Time for Bad News, is political and intimate. It's deeply character-driven and motivated by the urgency of testimony, of witness. And every poem presents the reader with a voice that is original, that is individual, and that it is also somehow collective. So we have mothers, and we have soldiers, and we have daughter, and we have rape victim, and we have man, and we have survivors, and we have an I, and we have a we. And through these really, I think, ordinary, but also often kind of extraordinary characters, we have a story of state-sponsored violence and also a story of insurgency. And if you were here for the last session, you would have heard Aruni describe his work across genres as in some ways concerned with questions about power, also very much with questions of justice and injustice, and also, I think, the defense and maintenance of democracy. His poetry centers people from the margins, from rural India, from Assam in the northeast, from places that don't get a lot of play in the mainstream media, on tribal communities. And in many ways, I think we could say that Aruni, your poetry, let's just focus on that for a minute, counters a kind of triumphant official national Indian discourse that many of you in this room will be familiar with as, say, the New India discourse, or the discourse of the G20 India, and an India that is very much still invested in performing its arrival onto the world stage. So my first question for you, and I have a couple if I may, is just as your poems tell us there is no good time for bad news, is there perhaps a bad time for good news?
Oh my God, that's one of the most difficult questions. I think I would say that in that vein, that just as there is no good time for bad news, in the same way, there is no bad time for good news. In fact, for good news, more so, yeah.
But what about, so I'm going to push you on this, so what about like in the context of India, and I think Mohan, some of his questions were also very much about this sort of dynamic. But we'll remember, for example, when, okay, and I'm going to go now into like a little bit of digression, and I'm going to rein myself in, I promise, but you know, when Arundhati Roy, for example, became the face of the old New India in the late 1990s, at the same time as the nuclear tests, and there was another moment of declaring India's arrival onto a certain kind of world stage, I think part of her response was to say that this is a bad time for good news. And as we are sort of surrounded by, I know I've used this word 3 times, but sort of triumphant discourse again, is it perhaps a bad time to be, I don't know, celebrating going to the moon? Or is that a very polemical question?
I also think we should also think about what is good news. For me, development, more hospitals. Recently, I just read yesterday, in fact, in Assam, that there will be license for liquor shops in the most remote areas of Assam. But 2 months ago, they just canceled the licenses of 2,000 primary schools in India, in Assam. And I know this is a problem happening in many of the underdeveloped states in India. So I think as long as it is true, I'm really for it. As long as it is true, good or bad, I'm really, really for it. But as long as it is varnished, as long as it is polished and galvanized into something else, I'm not interested in bad or good news. Then There Is No Good Time or Bad News is a titled poem of the collection. It's the longest poem I've ever written, also the longest in the collection, because it is actually based on the narrative perspective. It is written from the point of view of a woman whose son joins the insurgency. So every time there is a dead body or a corpse in the local police station, or they get the news of it, she has to go and identify the body. And every time the news comes, for 32 years, she has to relive and go through the trauma that possibly her son is dead. So the officer, who actually also has some stanzas in the poem, he often negotiates, because he played football with the insurgent. Like he said, when should I do it? Today is a good day, but there is no good time for bad news. So it's this debate that actually the poem repeatedly comes back to. But I really tried writing it from the point of view of the woman as much as possible. And I have written poems from the point of view of women, but the trauma of the mother was so much that the poem was drooping with that weight. And it would have just fallen off like a very, very heavily fruit-bearing plant, and the branch would have collapsed. So I actually get out of her perspective and write it from the point of view of the police officer, who is more used to bad news.
So let me ask just one more quick question before I invite you to read. But I used a language that I think you used before, that you've used in interviews, for example, about testimony and witnessing, and there's a very, we could call maybe historical aspect to your work, right? The stories that you're capturing for us in your poems are in reference to things that have happened. And so my question to you is whether, and it's an unfair question, because I think the answer kind of has to be both, but I'll sort of heuristically lay it out as a either or. But is your work more concerned with or motivated by sort of historical recovery in that sense, or is it more concerned with sort of the fashioning of the future? And if the answer is both and, then what is the relationship for you in your work between past and future and how they work together in your poems?
I think it is both, as you said, because as we are taking actions today, we are actually creating causes for the future. And I am definitely interested in historical recovery because our stories from this part of the country has been erased deliberately through misinformation, and the recovery part is really important for me. I mean, I came to Delhi in 2004 to study literature, and I was really shocked for the first time when I saw that the price of onion was the front page news, and electricity prices has risen, and that was the front page news. Because I couldn't imagine that 5 people are shot dead. That's the front page news. 7 women raped from the same family. That's the front page news for me in Assam. And I really read growing up all of these things. And then I asked my father, what does it really mean, you know? And I was 10 years old. He couldn't explain it to me. So that was the news I grew up. I knew I had a preconceived idea of what a front page news would be like as an undergraduate student when I came to Delhi. So, and I realized that people had no idea about what was going on in Nagaland, in Manipur, in Assam and Tripura, where all of these marginal states in India, including Kashmir. Kashmir gets some coverage at least, but all of these smaller, lesser known insurgencies and violence, it doesn't get. But it doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted. But for me, that's why I had to tell these stories in some ways, because otherwise nobody would ever know that this has happened. But also, as I read more, as I became a master's student and I grew, I realized that storytelling was really, really important in human rights work, because the hope that somebody will actually listen to this story and be moved is the only hope in certain kind of situations.
So will you share one of your poem stories with us?
Sure. I think I'll share something very different because I have spoken a lot about it, and both my books, fiction, actually deal with the insurgency. I'm going to go back to 1950. In 1950, there was a huge earthquake in Northeast India, and it was 8.7 or 8.9 in the Richter scale. So it was a pretty massive, big-ass earthquake. And my grandmother would never stop talking about it. So this poem is called My Grandmother Tells Me About the Earthquake in 1950. First, it was just the ants, like water bubbles, blood that oozes out of a wound. They emerged from their holes carrying grains of rice. We thought it was because of the impatient, slanting rains that must have percolated, flooded their bedrooms, dining rooms, living rooms. But soon, even though it wasn't the season of fleeing birds, the birds left their nests. Angry crows flew from one tree to another as if one of their own had been killed. But they just cawed like frightened people. They didn't try to claw our cheeks, pierce our eyes, as if they were trying to tell us the secret knowledge of the ants, alert us, as they always did, about uninvited guests. One evening, the wild ducks, the sparrows, the kingfishers, the woodpeckers left noisily. Empty nests with eggs, nude beehives that hung from large branches, dripping gold and honey in the sun, forming puddles below it, no ants to drown in sticky sweetness. It was then we knew something was coming, though we didn't expect it would be the river, because we had come to this village fleeing the furies of another river that attacked paddy fields, houses, and swept away brothers, sisters, mothers, lovers, concubines. On the day it came, August 15, 1950, we were planning to gather at the school playground to sing the anthem, distribute sweets. But I fell down while trying a bun, and I thought a dacoit had entered, pushed me to take away my gold necklace. I couldn't stand up, and the rattling walls told me to crawl out, screaming for your grandfather. The courtyard was slimy with thousands of earthworms germinating from the soft soil, while water from the hot spring that had sprouted in our courtyard burned my cheeks. One of my legs stuck in a deep crack. When the trees shook their heads, we didn't know about the newborn river that had sprouted from the chest of a nearby mountain. We didn't know it was 1,000,000 times stronger than a bomb called the Fat Man. We didn't know that the creator of Fat Man and Little Boy had looked at the test explosion and recited a chant from the Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Even without you, every warrior in the enemy camp will cease to be. But the ants and the birds and the howling dogs and the howling foxes knew. So they left, so they howled, barked. Thank you.
Aruni, would you leave us with one last poem?
Sure. I actually couldn't find a copy of my own poetry collection while packing, so I have this iPad. Okay, I have a poem. During the insurgency, there were a lot of peoples who came to the Northeast and Assam and tried to do developmental work. And one of them was a very well-known social activist who actually tried to save the biggest river island in the world. Once upon a time, this river island called Majuli was the biggest river island in the world, but because of the lack of conservation, it has become really, really shrunk now, and it is probably no more the biggest river island. But it has a very rich tradition of the Vaishnavite culture that started in the 15th century. Classical dance and art is still taught there, and monasteries exist there. It's very beautiful. But this man came to protect the river island, and he was killed by the insurgents, thinking that he was actually a spy of the government. But the people still continue to love him, and people are very upset. His name is Sanjay Ghosh, actually. But he is kind of memorialized in this poem, but I also, as I said, my poems are stories and fiction, so I depart from that. But this is a tribute to him. The man who loved to plant water spinach. The man who told us to plant water spinach to stop the river from far away. He wore brown leather shoes, checked shirts, torn blue jeans, and no hat in the breezy summer of the river island. The sound of bell metal and devotional songs welcomed him. Women admired the blue veins on his neck, gifted him cotton gamusas, hoping he would pluck orchids for them. But he was just interested in the river, in planting water spinach. Old women who had lost their gold and husbands in floods, children orphaned by waves, and Muslims who had to throw their loved ones into the river since there was no place to bury the dead, embraced him as one of their own, started loving him more than those men who carried guns, stopped the production of local liquor, punished roadside Romeos by making them hold their ears in public or smear soot from the bottom of large cauldrons on their faces. That's what the gun-loving moralists didn't like. Why was he interested in stopping the river? Why did he plant water spinach? They didn't believe that he wasn't an Indian spy. One dawn, they tied his hands and carried him away from the shrinking island he loved so much. When they pushed him, he transformed into a turtle that loved porridge and paddled into the unreachable parts of the river. Until noon, they searched. In a distant land he came from, his wife fed rice to crows. For months, there was no news of him. Years later, one of those young girls who were orphaned by the river met a large, old, wise turtle with torn jeans wrapped around its body. When they catch me, chop my limbs before I am killed, the turtle said, let the village feast on me. You plant my flippers in 4 different corners of the island, and I will protect it by covering it in the form of water spinach. Thank you.
We're going to leave you all wanting more, but I encourage you to read these poets' work. I want to thank you all so much for sharing not just your thoughts with us, but your poems, your readings. I think we've all kind of, listening to poetry together, like listening to music together, is a very special experience. There's something kind of, it's rhythmic, it's musical, it's both responsive to the world and transports us to another world together. We've actually covered a huge amount of ground temporally and geographically just in this session. And it's amazing that we can do that in just a few pages. So thank you, Rohan. Thank you, Aruni. Thank you, Aris. And please join me in thanking our poets again for reading with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ragini. Thank you, everyone.